we actually had a really large amount of feedback demanding the return of Andy Smith, who seems to have a slightly bigger fan base than Taylor Swift. So here he is to talk to us about neurodiversity affirming practice. Andy, over to you.
Awesome, thank you. And it's so nice to see everyone. Thank you for coming. I actually made like a presentation outline, but then I thought like some people have seen me speak already, so I wasn't sure what's helpful. So then I put a survey out, and then decided to scrap my presentation outline and made a new presentation based on the questions people put in the survey. So I'm hoping the presentation is going to answer most people's questions that they wrote. It also means that I finished this presentation 20 minutes before this webinar actually started, so that's a lot of fun. The second thing to mention is the last time I did one of these webinars was 3 years ago, and I still feel really guilty because we didn't have time for questions at the end because we had so much we wanted to say. So I've tried my very best to keep the presentation short so that people can ask questions at the end. So yeah, that's it. I hope that sounds okay. Yes, so who am I? I am Andy. I am autistic. I was diagnosed when I was 20. Which is I've got I made a mistake already. I was diagnosed in 2017, not in 2018. And I wrote the word autismoid because in spectrum gaming, the young people call me the autismoid, and apparently we lead some sort of like autism army of young people. So I thought I promised them that I'd say that. In terms of my forest school journey, when I was first diagnosed as autistic, I was really keen on learning lots and lots about autism, and it just became like a special interest where I just read like hundreds of books and all sorts of stuff. And I randomly went into Waterstones and I saw Michael James's book, Forest School and Autism. I didn't know what Forest School was, but I picked up the book, read it, and it just felt like magic. And it felt like one of those things where I read it and I just thought, if everyone had something like this, it would be life-changing for so many people who are really struggling. I loved it so much, I just randomly messaged Michael on LinkedIn and wrote a gigantic essay saying how much I love the book and that sort of stuff. And then as a result of that, he invited me to come and speak with him at the 2019 Forest School Association conference to talk about young people's views and the outdoors and that sort of thing. At this time, I still had never seen a forest school in practice. But when I came to the conference, I just like fell in love with everything forest school. I noticed there were so many practitioners at the conference who were there because they were so passionate about doing things for young people and adults, but also everyone had found their way into forest school as a result of things like working in schools and recognizing there's a better way to support young people, or recognizing how important nature is and wanting to bring back to more people. So it was a magical place which made me devoted to like forest school life, I think. And then since then I then set up a forest school which we've been running for 4 years, which is for autistic young people. So we have one forest school which is for 8 to 12-year-olds and one for 13 to 17-year-olds, and we've run that for 4 years. One disclaimer I need to say, which is actually really cheeky, is I'm not actually a qualified forest school leader. So I've read loads of books about it and been to lots of conferences, but I am awful at paperwork. Like I've been on 2 different forest school leader training courses and I just can't do it. And like I had to write in my latest one, I had to write an essay about different behavioral approaches and that sort of stuff. And I just got really angry and couldn't do it. I just thought, I don't want to write about these rubbish people. Skinner can get in the bin. I just want to talk about our practice and why we believe in it. So I haven't actually become a qualified leader yet. And my deadline for my current paperwork is in 2 weeks. So we'll see whether I get that in or not. But yeah. Anyway. Last night I thought I'd ask the young people, what do they say about our forest school? The responses were quite funny. So we've got, well, I can't really speak for the entire forest school genre, but the SG one mainly comprises of a bunch of autistic kids ramping up their autism to the max in the woods. It's peak. You'll never experience something as fun as forest school with SG, regardless of which FC game you own. FC is FIFA, and he said that because I play lots of FIFA. But basically, like these quotes are quite funny and interesting. But I think what I got out of it was that our young people have a real sense of community where they felt comfortable to like take the mick a bit because it's like a second home to them, if that makes sense. But yeah. In terms of a plan for today, like I said, people filled in lots of survey responses, and I'm hoping to cover most of the questions people had, and I've put them into categories. So one of the big things people asked a lot about was language to describe neurodiversity. So what does it mean? How do you talk about it? The second thing was about how you support neurodivergent young people to sort of mix with neurotypical kids and that sort of stuff. So a section on neuroharmony, a third thing on collaborative problem solving, so how to resolve issues and things when young people are struggling. The next one is crisis support, so how to support people when they're really stressed. Pathological demand avoidance. Loads of people asked about that. And finally, the thing people actually asked about the most was around supporting neurodivergent staff and what's helpful for those people. So we've got that later on as well. Yeah, I hope that all sounds okay. Please feel free to ask questions or type in the chat at any time. I normally stream Minecraft for our young people, so I'm good at like multitasking. But yeah, does that all sound okay? Any questions or thoughts before we start? Yeah, sounds good. Okay. Cool. So, neurodiversity and language. I thought this graphic was really helpful, but for explaining what neurodiversity is. But in a nutshell, neurodiversity refers to the natural diversity of human minds. Just like people have different skin color, different hair colors, eye colors, different levels of physical ability, there's different ways that people's brains work too. It's one of those things which I think it's important to view as a biological fact. There's about 20% of people, about 20%, I don't think exact figures are known, are neurodivergent. That is so many people, but it can't just be a coincidence. It makes sense that it's just part of natural diversity of people. You also have the term neurodivergent. So neurodivergent is an umbrella term for people who have a brain that sort of diverges from what is typical or sort of defined as normal. I think there's still a lot of conversation around what this actually means. So some people believe that this means sort of neurological differences like autism, ADHD, dyspraxia, Tourette's syndrome, and that sort of stuff. And there's other people who say actually it's more complex than that. It isn't just those neurological conditions. It includes things like trauma, because trauma affects your brain wiring and changes how things happen. It includes things like if you have a brain injury, that affects how your brain works. So anything that is different from normal is included in neurodivergent. Typically, when people talk about neurodivergent, for example, if the NHS talks about a pathway for neurodivergent people, they typically mean things like autism, ADHD, and that sort of stuff. But a lot of people believe that isn't that helpful, and it's much more helpful to broaden it because neurodivergence is a lot more than just that. The third section is neurotypical. So this refers to having a mind or functioning that falls within the societal standards of normal. But that doesn't mean that all those people are the same. It's even within being neurotypical, everyone's brains work in different ways. It's just there's these standards people have set of what normal is, and people are more or less within that. Again, it's quite hard to define what that means. And finally, neurodiverse. So this is a term that can't describe an individual. It describes a group of individuals. For example, just like if a group is diverse, so there's a mix of genders or race and that sort of stuff. If a group is neurodiverse, there's a mix of different ways people's brains work. Often people say an individual person is neurodiverse. That isn't really like that grammatically correct because it's to refer to a group rather than an individual, if that makes sense. When it comes to neurodiversity, one of the biggest myths that people think about one of the biggest myths when it comes to it is some people believe that like neurodiversity means that these people are amazing and we have superpowers, and it's being neurodivergent is a talent, and as a result, the term has had like quite a bit of like pushback online where you might have seen sort of from people say like my autistic child struggles quite a lot, so I don't believe in the term neurodivergent because it's not something great. Actually, it's something that's really difficult for them. And I think it's quite an interesting thing where actually I think that what the term means is that it's actually been misrepresented quite a lot. The term neurodivergent isn't about saying you have some sort of like special power or ability. I see it as like it's a biological fact that people's brains work in different ways. Some neurodivergent people still really, really struggle and have it. Some people need to have lifelong support and that sort of stuff. Reason I thought I'd mention this is there was a couple of people in the survey who said that some parents don't like the term neurodivergent being used because it minimizes the challenges their young person experiences. And I think that's because the term has been used incorrectly in some spaces. Does that make sense? I might be waffling a little bit. But yeah. So when it comes to why this idea of neurodiversity is really important, I really love these graphics from NeuroWild. So it says, each plant is different. If you assume you have one of these, I don't actually know what that is. Feel free to say if you know what it is. When you actually have one of these, you might accidentally be harming it. What works for one plant does not work for the other plant. It's important to know what type you have so you can nurture it. Yeah, then you can help them thrive. And I think a key point here, again, it's not about saying some people, like, I'm not some sort of special autistic person with some amazing superpower that makes me better than everyone else. It's everyone is like a different plant and needs a different environment to sort of be cared for and to sort of be at your best. And it's important to recognize some plants are harder to cater for too. Some needs lots of like input, whereas some need a lot less. But what matters is that with the right support in the right space, that plant can still thrive, just like every young person or person can. As I said, some neurodivergent people have significantly more support needs than other people do. But for me, what I think is really important is every single person on the planet, regardless of how much support they need, deserves to have a happy life. And it's important to recognize that it's the people around them who are able to make that happen for them, if that makes sense. I often think about, like, when it comes to being an adult, people always think about the future and say, we need to make sure this person gets a really good job or they're able to get into employment when they're older. And that's the one thing that's seen as the gold standard for some like neurodivergent young people. When actually there might be some people who need lifelong support, but then at the same time, if they're really, really happy and they experience pure joy every day, that's also really, really important. And I think that needs to be recognized as well. On the next slide, I don't take credit for this quote. I'm stealing it from Michael James. People might have heard the golden equation, which is sort of autism plus environment equals outcome, from Dr. Luke Bearden. And what this says is, like, autism is the name for the way your brain is wired, and that's unchangeable. But the environment is changeable. So the outcomes for autistic people are determined by the social and physical environment that that person's in. But I think a really important thing for me, when it comes to neurodiversity affirming practice, it's not just about the person who has the label and making the environment right for them. It's, outcomes for every single person on the planet are determined by the environment that person is. It's not about this person is autistic, so let's adapt things. It's about having the right approach that works for everyone. When we have the optimal environment, then young people can thrive, and that's all there is to it, basically. On that topic, one of my favorite books is a book called The Gardener and the Carpenter. I'm not actually a parent, but it's a book about parenting. And there's this quote that I wanted to read out because I like it quite a lot. It says, love doesn't have goals or benchmarks or blueprints, but it does have a purpose. The purpose is not to change the people we love, but to give them what they need to thrive. Love's purpose is not to shape our beloved's destiny, but to help them shape their own. It isn't to show them the way, but to help them find a path for themselves, even if the path they take isn't one we would choose ourselves, or even one we would choose for them. And I think that reinforces the point of the importance of the environment. I think often what a lot of young people say is there's a huge focus on making them what they need to be to sort of thrive as an adult or do really, really well, when actually sometimes what you want and your own views are very different to what people think. I'll give you an example. It's probably like quite a sad one, but when I was younger, I was like the stereotypical autistic person who's really good at maths. So my mum used to say she wanted me to be a famous mathematician, I'll make lots of money, and then I'll be really happy. And then she did everything she could to sort of set me on that path so that I could then be successful as a person. But then for me, that isn't what I wanted to do. I wanted to do things to support young people and sort of do things to sort of better improve outcomes for them. But then from her perspective, that wasn't like normal. That wasn't the path I needed to go on. So then she focused on like different things to what I needed. And that then resulted in me sort of like struggling quite a lot. Whereas the alternative would have been setting up an environment where it's okay to follow my interests and my passions and sort of set things up that way. I don't think I've explained that very well, but does that make some sort of sense? I don't know. Yeah, okay. And yeah, as I said then, when it comes to neurodiversity affirming practice, I think it's really important that diagnosis technically shouldn't actually matter when it comes to that. I think a lot about when young people are struggling, often it feels like people need a diagnosis for that to then be okay. Like if I flap my hands and twirl, if you're not diagnosed, it's because you're weird and need to stop doing it. If you have a diagnosis of autism, it's because you're stimming. Like if you are really struggling in an environment and you're really overwhelmed and you throw something, if you don't have a diagnosis, you're being naughty and you're choosing to sort of make a fuss. If you are autistic, then actually it's because you're overwhelmed or you have sensory overload. And it's that thing of actually every single young person is intrinsically motivated to do well, have positive connections with people. No one wants to struggle. So everyone deserves to be treated with compassion and with unconditional positive regard, not just those people who get a diagnosis. Not just because, like I said, every young person is motivated to do well, but also some people might be really, really struggling. And often the people who are struggling the most are the people who don't get a diagnosis. For example, there's research that shows about 50% of neurodivergent girls are diagnosed after the age of 16. But you're still neurodivergent the whole time, but you just don't get support. You're just told that you're being naughty and refusing to do things. And that's like quite an injustice. And I've added this graphic onto the screen, which I think is really important. And I guess it's one of those things where it's not really consensus, where like previously how I've typically described being neurodivergent is like my brain's wired differently to most people. So autism is a name for the way my brain's wired, and that's how I typically talk about it. But actually, that's an idea which I'm still exploring because it's a bit more complicated than that. Because a diagnosis is based on behavior, things that you see, what my diagnosis means is I tick all of the boxes, which mean that I get a diagnosis of autism. So I have enough autism-related struggles to get that diagnosis. As it shows in the graphic, there might be someone who's struggling a lot more than me. So they might have some identified struggles which are related to autism and ADHD and dyslexia and Tourette's, but they don't reach the threshold for each of those individual things. So they might have more overall struggles, but then they don't get a diagnosis of anything. And then they're stuck in this thing of actually, what does that mean? They're not neurotypical, but they're not officially neurodivergent because they don't fit one of those categories that some random professors made like 60 years ago or wherever it was. So I guess that's one idea which I'm reflecting on quite a lot. Yeah. And that leads on to the next topic, which is about neuroharmony. So one of the big things people asked is when should neurodivergent and neurotypical kids mix, or what should those groups look like? How can they work together? And I think neuroharmony is like one of my favorite words. And if you saw my last webinar, I talked about it there as well. So neuroharmony is about having the right level of compromise so that all young people feel comfortable, safe, and happy, regardless of their neurotype. It's that thing of often when you're neurodivergent, what tends to happen is you're expected to make all the adaptations so that an environment works for you. Like I remember back when I was at school, I needed lots of movement, but I wasn't allowed to. I had to sit really still. I'm sensitive to lights. I had to deal with really bright lights every day because I wasn't allowed to put my hood up. I'm sensitive to noise, but you wasn't allowed to wear headphones. And if you wore ear defenders, people picked on you for it. So you spend your whole life trying to make adaptations for people. But then if an environment was set up in a way that works for me as an individual, there are other people that might not work for. Like, for example, while I struggle in noisy environments, some people need noise or they'll be understimulated and will really struggle to focus. So it's that thing of what is the right level of compromise so that everyone feels comfortable in the environment that they're in. To give an example of what this can look like in forest school, I've actually got some young people and this is actually a real life scenario, what happened at our forest school. So feel free to put any thoughts in the chat of what might help. So there's 4 young people. So Beth loves play fighting. She tries to invite everyone to have a giant clan war every session. When she comes to the woods, first thing she's doing is making a spear and a bow and arrow, and then she'll go to everyone one by one. Hey, want to go to war? So that's Beth. Next is Ryan. Ryan really, really hates losing. You might recognize Ryan because Ryan can be quite tricky in the woods sometimes. So if he starts losing, he can make up rules that feel really unfair for the other team. Like sometimes we play hide and seek, and if I tig him, he's suddenly created a special power that freezes me. And whenever I'm within 5 meters of him, I always get frozen, so I can never actually tig him. Which is fine for me. I can deal with that. But then if he's losing in a game with other people in the woods, it feels really unfair for the other team when he makes up these rules so that they can't win. And if he gets really upset, he can have quite big explosive meltdowns. Third person is Faith. So Faith is sensitive to noise. So it becomes really upset when the others are shouting and fighting. They can be having a really fun, friendly, I'm not sure if friendly is the right word, but having a friendly war. But then she finds that really difficult because it's really noisy. Finally, Lily has selective mutism, wants to take part, but is unable to speak during the session. So Beth asks if she wants to play, and she can't say yes. So with neuroharmony, you think about everyone's needs and then work out what is the compromise. So feel free to put thoughts in the chat. What do you do? What's helpful? I love that quote Robert put in the chat. Thank you. Yeah. Louise said AAC, so having some alternative communication for Lily to be able to sort of say yes or no or express her needs will be really helpful. Yeah, thank you. Whiteboards, yes. Cool. Lily, no pressure to speak, she'll communicate in the wrong way. Yeah. Maybe discussion around the game using picture prompts. Yeah. What about Ryan? Ryan who hates losing. And what about Faith? What does AAC mean? This is so bad that I've just forgotten it. Alternative something of communication. So it's about having alternative ways to communicate with people which don't involve speaking. So it could be from using a whiteboard to using an iPad to communicate and things like that. Faith have access to air defenders, role play, silent fights where it's team based, everyone has a turn to win. Yeah. Alternative augmentative communication, that's it, thank you. Other options for games that aren't a war game. Yeah. But then Beth says, I want a war game, I'm here for war. Ooh, okay. Well, let Ryan win in mini games and space to calm down. Yeah, everyone on my same team versus adults. Yeah, cool. Thank you. So I'll tell you. So, like I said, this is a real life scenario that has happened in our woods. So what we tend to do is, if someone has like, it's that thing of like there are very different needs and they can be quite complex, but there are ways you can find to get it to work through that sort of collaborative problem solving and working together. So one thing is with selective mutism. I think often young people are much more understanding than adults are. Like if a young person struggles to speak, often random adults expect them to be able to. But if you explain to young people, a lot of the time they get it and really accommodate for that. So we have like some little graphics that we've written with young people. And if someone has selective mutism, we share it with all the young people in advance so they know this person struggles to speak at times. Is it okay to let them be involved without expecting them to talk? And that's really helpful. One thing that we did is actually we expanded our boundary, so we had a designated war area. So then Faith isn't getting overwhelmed by the noise because we've got a war zone, and the rest is like I've just forgotten what it's called, the peace area where people aren't allowed to like war because other countries will get involved or whatever happens. With Ryan struggling with losing and making up these random rules at random times, one thing which we started to do is actually agree the game boundaries in advance. So what things can we do or what can't we do? When we were playing hide and seek, we have like really intense negotiations around he can't use magic spells, but he gets one stun grenade, and only if he uses it in an adult, not on any of the other young people. So we work out those sort of compromises that work for things. And again, like some people said in the chat, sometimes if someone's really struggling with that sort of thing, rather than having young people fight each other, we turn it into a bit of a campaign and we have young people versus adults. And I come along with my secret mission to take over the woods and we have to try their best to try and defeat me. Yeah, there's a few more comments in the chat. Explicit identification of different needs. Yeah. Allow each person to be the rule maker for each game so they have an element of control. 100%, yeah. Ensure Ryan feels safe enough to perhaps experience small losses. Yeah, I think that's quite an interesting one where with quite a few young people, they might not inherently struggle with losing, but then for a lot of our young people, they are really struggling at school or at home or whatever other thing. And as a result of struggling so much, their stress is so high that losing a game sends them over the edge when actually normally that might not always be an issue. Or it could be that someone's struggling so much that their self-esteem is so low at that moment in time that they need something good. They need a win to sort of have that sense of self-esteem because they're struggling so much.
Where is it?
Whoever just spoke, I think you were muted, sorry. But I hope you find it. Yeah. It's about balance as well, making sure losers and wins are equally matched. Yeah, 100%. Which is slightly off topic, but we also do football meetups and we have young people play, and I play as an adult, and I always put myself on the worst team because I run around a lot and can make it as fair as possible. So I think that works too. Um, anyway, okay, I've got one more scenario, and I'd love to know people's thoughts. Because it was asked about a lot. So, and sorry if you've heard me talk about this before, but the log circle. So let's say you run a forest school, and this is what you expect. You expect young people to sit at the log circle at the start of each session to go through the safety, go through the rules, and also do a feelings check-in where you go through each person one by one to sort of ask how they're feeling about the day. They must sit on a log and stay sat the entire time. My question here is, if we're looking at the idea of neuroharmony and making that compromise to meet people's needs, what needs might this way of working clash with? What potential barriers might young people experience? What needs might not be met through this? Demand avoidance, the need for autonomy, need for movement, autonomy and power, the need to move, yes. Freedom, yes. Sensory, uncomfortable, yes. No one ever talks about how uncomfortable log seats can be sometimes, especially when you're sat on a slanted one that's slightly off balance. But yeah, it's a class with young people with social anxiety, PDA profile. Yeah. Need to choose when to be involved or not. Not knowing what your feelings are doing. Yes. Eye contact, alexithymia. Yes. Anxiety, too much focus. Yes. Okay. So I've written a list of stuff I was thinking of. So, for example, people could be undersensitive to their sense of balance or their sense of proprioception, their body, which they need lots of movement to focus. So if you're sat still, you can't focus or listen, so you don't process the rules anyway. People can be sensitive to touch or smell. So if with sense of touch, that log seat that might feel fine to you, to someone else can feel really uncomfortable. If it's wet, that can be really tricky too. We have a young person at our forest school where if his pants get wet, he has to just pull them straight off and can't put them back on. So there's been like awkward situations a couple of times, but also that's an example of how sensitive people can be to that sense of touch. Sense of smell. Some people hate the smell of a fire. So sitting around a fire circle can be very distressing. Some young people, there's that myth that some autistic people don't have any empathy. Some young people have a really, really strong sense of empathy. So if you're hearing someone's feelings and you hear someone's having a bad day, that can ruin your entire day and you can really struggle with that and feel really overwhelmed. Someone in the chat mentioned alexithymia. That's where you have a bit of like a body to brain disconnect where sorry, I should probably explain this a bit more. Sorry, I'm going a bit fast. But one of the senses which often isn't talked about is the eighth sense, the sense of interoception. So that's feeling your internal bodily sensations and working out what they mean. So, for example, if your legs are shaking and your heart's beating really fast, that might mean that you're anxious. If your bladder feels full, that means you need a wee. And just like with the other senses, you can have a higher or lower sensitivity to that sense. But you can also experience something called alexithymia. And that's where you have a bit of like a body to brain disconnect where you feel the internal sensations, but your brain doesn't automatically tell you what that means. So like it can be like fast heartbeat, shaky legs. Am I having a heart attack? Am I going to die? I don't know what it means. Like, help. An example for me is where I used to feel anxious a lot of the time when I was younger, and I always felt a really tight chest pain in my chest. I thought it was because I had open heart surgery when I was younger, so my heart just hurt a lot. It was only when I went to have CBT sessions at university that the counsellor told me, when you feel anxious, you don't just feel it in the stomach, like I learned on the internet, you can feel it in your chest too. So that's when I recognised that that meant I was feeling anxious. So it's like, when you experience alexithymia, it's a bit like a maths equation where like shaky legs and fast heartbeat equals what? And you have to work it out manually. So if you're expected to share your feelings, you might not know what you're feeling, so it can be really tricky. Some people experience selective mutism, some might struggle to speak. One thing I remember from when I did my forest school leader training, the practical sessions, we had to do a feelings circle, and I was just thinking, I don't know any of these people. I don't feel comfortable sharing my emotions with them. So why are we expected to do that? So I just made stuff up every time. So that's an important factor too. you know, I won't go through them all. One more kind of I wanted to mention is when young people come to our sessions, some people have had the most stressful week where they've been in lessons all day, expected to sit still, not move, focus all day. They just want to be free. As Mel said in the chat, people want to run around and jump in a hammock or do whatever they need at that moment in time. For some young people, forest school is the only place where they can be free to do what they need to get their needs met. Yeah, there's lots of reasons. Anyway, with all of this in mind, what can you do instead? How do you meet these needs? Feel free to share in the chat. One of the reasons I thought this would be cool to talk about is I think for some, again, I'm not sure what people's forest school sessions look like, so feel free to share in the chat if you're up for it. But for me, all of the young people who attend our forest school are autistic. So I guess in other sessions which are similar to that, people might not have as high of a level of like need as a lot of our young people have. So people might be able to sit around a log circle in some sessions with some people, whereas at our sessions, it's physically impossible. Like we can't have every young person sat around the log circle. It doesn't work. So we have no option but to have alternatives to that, if that makes sense. Yeah. That we could share if they want to in a separate area to others. Yes. Safety talk while walking to base camp. Yes. Other ways of checking in, like visuals or a whiteboard, standing up and moving fire circle, drama games, things available to fiddle with, visual or written timetables, walk and talk. Yes. Yeah. We always pick young people up a 5-minute walk away from a forest school site so we can have that sort of walk and talk before we go and do the same when we leave as well. Yeah. Feeling stones, exploration and arrival routines along freedom. Yes. Yeah. So a few things which I wrote down as possible things that can be helpful. Invitations to join and ensuring everyone knows it's optional. Yeah. So things I said is, can you do a log circle at a later time? Let people come in, get what they need. If they need a swing or some time on a hammock, and then go and do a log circle. Do people have to sit down? Can people stand up? Can you have hammocks nearby? Are there things people can fidget with or play with or craft while you're sat around? One thing I think a lot about is, why do we have to do the same safety talk like every week? Like we've already heard it enough times. Like for me, we write our rules down, put them on a Google Doc, and we send them to young people in advance. And when they come to the sessions, we don't do a safety talk around the log circle because young people won't be able to sit down for long enough to do it. So young people get it before they come. So when we arrive, they're just free to do whatever they would like. And the other thing is actually in terms of those feelings activities, do you need to do them? Like, just you don't have to. Yeah, I think often when a lot of young people are sort of masking or they're used to a school environment where they have to pretend to be okay all the time, actually sometimes you don't get an authentic view of what their feelings are like anyway. Yeah, in our sessions, we don't actually ever have a set time where we go around a log circle or do any set activities. We send our rules and ways of working in advance, and we let people know to let us know if you have any questions or thoughts around it. Then once people come to the woods, they're free. So we do sometimes have times when people sit around the log circle, but it's more natural and authentic. They go because they want to be there. People are never asked to be there. The main way that happens is I love telling stories in the woods. So sometimes I'll just like start telling a story, and the next minute everyone's sat around listening, or we do like a group interactive one, and it's all really, really nice. But we never sort of like force it onto people. But yeah, cool. So that was it about neuroharmony. I hope that all sounded okay. The next, it's just like I'm just like jumping to different topics. I hope it's not too overwhelming, but let me know if I need to like slow down. I don't know. Yeah. The next thing is collaborative problem solving. So have people heard about like plan A, plan B, and plan C before? Is that thing people know about? Oh, I don't know. No. Okay. No. Okay. I'll talk about it. So, this idea was created by Dr. Ross Green, yes, as people said in the chat, and I found it a really, really helpful way for framing how things work. So basically, there's 3 different ways how we tend to approach things. So let's say you have an expectation for people to follow. Like, for example, let's use the log circle one. Let's say I want everyone to sit around a log circle. Plan A is you saying that person has to do it. Like, you have to sit around a log circle. If they don't do it, you're in trouble. I'm going to tell you off. That's plan A. Plan C is where you drop the expectation, you let it be. So, okay, we're not doing a log circle. I'm giving up. Like, do what you like. Plan B is I have this expectation that I think is really important or helpful. Can we work together to sort of problem solve and work out what can help with that thing? And I just find this a really helpful framing for working out when we are expecting things from young people, which of these plans are we doing and which is the best one to do right now? For example, if you're using plan A, if you're trying to get people to just do things, sometimes some young people can do it, they can comply. For some young people, they can't. That can result in an increase in stress if you demand or expect them to do things, and then they can become more stressed and that demand isn't met. As I said, it can result in more stress. If you're just sort of trying to push someone to do things, it doesn't really help with solving problems. If someone isn't meeting an expectation, there's usually a reason behind it. If we just look at their behavior and not the reason, we might not be solving the problem that they have. So instead, young people might be internalizing their needs, and then they might sort of struggle on the inside, and you might not always see it. Plan C is helpful sometimes if things are really stressful and like you don't know what to do, like things aren't working, so you're like, okay, it's okay for now, and that's a really good way to sort of reduce stress related behavior. But at the same time, if there are some things that are important, I think like plan B is the best way to sort of do things. I don't think I'm explaining this very well, but the reason I want you to include it is often you have like the plan A approach of I'm very shouty. If you don't do what I say, I'm going to tell you off and that sort of stuff. But then the people who sort of move away from that, sometimes things don't work. And that's because people go from plan A to plan C. So rather than saying, we have these expectations you have to meet, it's like we don't have expectations. I mean, things go into chaos and things don't really work. And that's why I think plan B is really important. So having an approach that doesn't use things like rewards and punishments and shouting at people and that sort of stuff doesn't mean do nothing. You can have a different approach that doesn't focus on those things, but still have those expectations or ways of working that work for people. And that is what plan B is. So it's about working out a way to work in partnership with young people and collaborate. It's that recognition that young people are doing the best they can right now based on their current level of stress and their skill levels and the environment. So what can we collaborate to do to meet those underlying needs so that those expectations are then met in that environment? Does that make sense? Yeah. If it's helpful, I'm not going to talk about it today because people have probably heard me talk about it before, but within Spectrum Gaming, we use an approach that is called the NEST approach. So this is like a 4-step collaborative problem-solving method. So the first step is nurture. This is when someone is in crisis or experiencing a meltdown or a shutdown. At that point in time, you are so stressed that you're not in control. You're having that same survival response as what happens when you're in life-threatening danger. So what you need to do is have those low arousal supportive strategies so that those people feel okay again. Once people are feeling calm and relaxed, that's when you can do that problem solving. If you supported someone through a meltdown or through stress, and you just leave it there and then continue like nothing has happened the next time you go to the woods, that's ignoring the fact that actually something really bad happened. It's important to identify what the unmet needs were, what caused the stress, so that you reduce the chance of that happening in the future. So that's where you have this 3-step process of empathizing, hearing their story, hearing what the issues are, sharing the wider context, and sort of coming up with those solutions together. There's a free booklet on the NEST approach online. I've also publicly shared our Forest School behaviour policy, which is actually called an anti-behaviorism behaviour policy, which talks about the NEST approach and why we don't believe in rewards and punishments and that sort of stuff. So you can find that online for free, and I'm happy to send a link if that's helpful. But yeah. But when I talk about using that plan B and working with young people to meet expectations, a really, really important caveat to that is, are your expectations the right ones? So if I have the expectation of, I expect every young person to sit around a log circle for 10 minutes while I give them a safety talk, that is an expectation that some young people are never ever going to be able to meet. So when it comes to having those expectations, it's also important to work out, are your expectations the right ones? Are they fair? Are they affirming? Are they expectations that young people can actually do? I think often as adults, we forget that like young people's brains are still developing. So there's lots of things which we can do or we find easy that young people aren't ready for yet. For example, young people don't start to develop empathy until the age of 8. So if you have a 5-year-old and you're expecting them to understand someone else's point of view, they might really struggle with that because they're just not old enough yet. So it's stuff like that which are really important considerations. I don't actually work with anyone under the age of 8. So sorry if I was completely wrong about like the exact ages and stuff there, but free to let me know. Yeah. And that then leads on to pathological demand avoidance. So one thing I find really helpful is the PDA Panda. And one of the points on this is pick your battles. So it's that thing of when you look at those things like expectations, again, it's unlearning those things of what does that young person really need in that environment. For example, one thing which we changed recently is we allow swearing. Some people might be looking at me and thinking I'm really, really evil, but then when you think about it, young people often have higher expectations than adults. Like adults are allowed to swear and it's socially acceptable, but then we tell young people they're not allowed to. So we have like lower expectations than young people have themselves. And another thing is like expecting young people to engage in activities at our sessions. Like if young people want to sit in a hammock and do nothing the whole time, they are allowed to do that. We don't pressure them to get involved with things because they're doing the best they can at the moment. Yeah, I don't know. Do other people allow swearing? Is that like controversial? I don't really know. But yeah, I don't know. We had one of those things where we had a discussion with young people about it. And what young people said is they want to allow swearing as long as it's not directed at people and used in an insulting way. And that's what they agreed was the thing that worked for them. But yeah. Swearing are just words to express frustration most of the time. I swear at my son's forest school. Yeah, makes sense. So when it comes to pathological demand avoidance, I think my view on PDA is very different to the majority of people. So I want to try and explain it in case it's helpful. But anyway, I've got a quote here which says, in place of structure, routine, firm boundaries, praise, rewards, consequences is a person-centered approach based on negotiation, collaboration, and flexibility. And that's a quote from people who talk about what strategies PDAs need. And what people say is typical autism strategies don't work for PDAs. So people need this different approach. And what I think about every time I read things like this is actually, it isn't that those approaches don't work for PDAs, it's that they don't work for anyone. And like those typical autism strategies which are created, like having a firm routine that people must stick to and always having praise and punishment and rewards, I don't think that's focused on meeting the needs of our autistic young person. What those things are is, I have this view of what this young person needs to be like, so I'm going to sort of modify their behavior to get them to be like that. And I think you then see two things that happen. One is some young people then internalize their needs and they mask, and then as a result they look fine, and that's seen as a success. And people from the outside looking in say, okay, praise, rewards, consequences are really good autism strategies because this young person looks fine. What they don't see is on the inside, that person is really, really stressed and really, really struggling. And then what you see is the people these things don't work for. So if you use rewards or consequences and then someone's behavior gets worse or they struggle more, people then say, okay, that person's a PDA, they need something else. When actually, I really, really strongly believe, as Dana said in the chat, these strategies are what every young person needs. Just some young people then learn to internalize the things which internalize their needs instead, which really doesn't work. Another thing I wanted to mention here is I think that PDA is really important and recognizing what it is really essential. But at the same time, I see like a bit of a worrying trend, which is what happened with autism about 5 years ago. So when I was like involved in stuff in the autism world, what started to happen was people often used autism as an excuse for a young person's needs not to be met. Like you would hear people say, this young person can't access forest school because they're autistic, or this young person can't go to a local youth club because they're autistic. And what happens is it gets used as a reason or a scapegoat for that person's needs to not be met. And it's the same where I see like this young person's a PDA, so forest school isn't appropriate for them. And I just think like that's nonsense. It doesn't make sense. And I think it's really important that while PDA needs recognition, it's also important to recognize there are lots of reasons behind demand avoidance, and it's really important to identify what the reason is behind it to make sure that person gets the right support, rather than just saying this person has PDA, they can't be helped, it's just not going to work. As some examples of reasons behind demand avoidance, One is, if you're really stressed or really dysregulated, if you feel unsafe, you become demand avoidant. Anyone who is stressed avoids demands because you need that control when you're feeling dysregulated. One common experience in autistic people is something called autistic inertia. There's lots of really interesting research around this, and this is where the amount of energy it takes to switch from one task to another is more energy than actually doing the task itself. So you might meet autistic people who like for me, I am rubbish at tidying up. When I go to clean my house, it feels like, oh my gosh, this is the biggest task ever. I'm never going to be able to do it. I'm useless. It's a mess. What do I do? Then when I actually get the energy to do it, after procrastinating for 5 hours, it takes 10 minutes to do. And I just think, why am I like this? It's awful. But there's lots of research into inertia. And, you know, that can look like demand avoidance when actually there's a reason behind it. And when you know it's inertia, there are things that can help. Like, for example, if I'm struggling to write a funding application, I have to write lots of them and I hate them. What is a small step I can do to kickstart it and like kick inertia up the bum? So one thing I do now is if I'm starting a funding application, I'll type loads and loads of swear words, because once I've got into the motion of doing something, it then makes it much easier to get into that flow. And it's the same where if a young person's experiencing inertia, they might need some physical support or you to come and help to do the first step to enable them to go on to do the thing. It's not just, we can't help you, it's demand avoidance. It's what is the reason behind it, what can help. Another one is monotropism. So monotropism is a theory around how autistic people process information. So a lot of people are labeled as polytropic, where you can sort of process lots of things like a little bit, whereas a lot of autistic people and people with ADHD are seen as monotropic, where you can focus on one thing quite intensely. That then means that if you're focusing on one thing, it can be really difficult to move from one thing to something else because you've got your whole focus on that. So that can look like demand avoidance. If someone's low on mental energy, if they're exhausted after a really long day, they might struggle to do a demand because they're just exhausted. You know, people can have sensory differences. If someone's oversensitive to their sense of balance, then actually doing some things can be really hard. If people are wanting to play hide and seek, that requires a lot of movement. And if you're sensitive to balance, that can be really tricky. So people might be seen as defiant if they don't want to get involved, when actually it's because of their sensory differences becoming a barrier to do that. The whole point here is there's lots of reasons behind demand avoidance. It's important to understand the reason behind it to know what support someone needs. When it comes to pathological demand avoidance, the term is also an interesting one, as some people have said in the chat, because I don't think it makes sense. So the term is pathological demand avoidance. Pathological means every demand is seen as difficult and unable to do. When actually I've got an example. Sorry if you've heard this before, but in Spectrum Gaming, one game I've played with young people is a game called Sea of Thieves, and that's where it's 4 people on a ship, and you sort of cruise together and get treasure and get really rich and then decorate your ship and repeat that over and over again. Anyway, once I played with 3 young people who all have a diagnosis of pathological demand avoidance, which means that they avoid every demand according to what that says. However, when we played together, they asked me to be the captain of the ship, so I'm driving it, ordering people about, telling them what to do, and all of the young people did it. So then it's that thing of like, first of all, the term pathological doesn't make sense because it's not every demand. Secondly, I think what really matters is what I think matters more than every demand is a threat. It's about the power balance and how you're perceived in that sort of relationship and the power dynamics between you. And I think in that team as a group together, I valued them as equals to me and they knew that. So their views were completely valid and accepted, and we were able to challenge each other and collaborate and sort of make those decisions together. If I made an order and they disagreed with it, they were allowed to challenge it and we could have that communication. So then because we had that equal power balance, they didn't experience that demand avoidance when I made demands while we were on the ship. And I think that's a really important thing to consider. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah, I think having that equal power balance is really difficult because that means that you're losing control over the situation, but it's really important to meet those young people's needs. Yeah. Okay. Now to jump, any questions about that before I jump to another completely different topic? You feel comfortable with pathological demand avoidance, or does persistent drive for autonomy feel better? I think persistent drive for autonomy is a great term, but I think it doesn't cover everything. Like for me, I think that some young people display as pathologically demand avoidant because they have a really, really strong drive for autonomy. For some people, that is really true. If I went back a few years, I identified as a PDA, everyone who speaks to me and works with me says that I have pathological demand avoidance. But I know that the reason behind it is because I have that really, really strong need for autonomy. So that makes sense for me. But there are other people where that isn't the reason behind it. There's different reasons behind that demand avoidance. So while it is true for some people, that doesn't encapsulate everything, if that makes sense. Like the way I'm sort of viewing it is like pathological demand avoidance is an umbrella term, and there's lots of reasons behind it, and you need to know the individual reasons to make sure people get the right support. And that's like, I don't know, that's my current view. That might be an unpopular one. You might disagree with it, that's fine. Just that's just my personal opinion. But yeah. Okay, so the next topic is supporting young people with dysregulation. I think with this, I've talked about the approach already, which people can read about, but I think an important thing for me here is supporting young people with dysregulation starts way before they get dysregulated, and even before people actually get onto the forest school site as well. And like for me, there's a few things which we always do that I feel is really important, so that when people do eventually come to the woods, it's a much more positive space. I think that I'm quite lucky that we have the liberty and sort of flexibility to do a lot of these things that people might not be able to, but I'll talk through them and I'd love to hear what you think. So the first one, I think with having a relational approach, relationships are the most important thing. So building relationships with young people before they come to their sessions is really important, so they know someone and have someone who they can trust at the site. A second thing is, for a lot of neurodivergent people, uncertainty can be a really, really huge cause of anxiety. So what information can you give to people before they come to sessions? That can include things like pictures of the venue, videos, you know, knowing how many people are there, having information about the staff who go. That all of our staff have one-page profiles that are sort of shared with young people because we know everything about them. They know nothing about us. So that sort of helps to sort of fix that. Another thing is sharing expectations. Often young people have that mindset of if they go somewhere, they must stay there the whole time. There's no way out. When actually letting young people know, if you go, there's a quiet space you can go to if you get overwhelmed. You're allowed to leave at any time if you don't want to be there. Letting young people know that can be really important to reduce people's anxiety enough to be able to go to it. Another thing is collaboration around activities. I think when young people first go to an activity, they might be really anxious about it. And when you're really anxious, when you don't feel psychologically safe, you sort of lose that drive for autonomy, and people might need a bit more structure while they get eased into knowing how things work. So it can be when you first come to the session, what is it that you'd like to do? And young people might say, I want to make a bow, or I want s'mores, and just have that activity ready for if they need that bit of structure in the short term before they're becoming a free autonomous potato. I don't know why I said that, but you get the point. Enabling pre-visits so people can see what it looks like in practice. And I think another thing is setting expectations for parents as well, so that letting parents know when they come to forest school, it's their zone. Don't expect them to do lots of things and get involved with everything, because people can accidentally cause overwhelm as well when that happens. Then when it comes to the sessions itself, we find having a phased transition really helpful. So rather than saying everyone come at 12 o'clock and then we go to the site together, we have a bit of like a 30-minute window when people can arrive, so that people can come early if they find that helpful, or they can come late, whatever works for them. And the same with leaving. Some people might want to leave a little bit early. Some people might have to be the last person to leave, and that's what works for them as an individual. Again, we're lucky that we can do that. Making the environment low demand, so people don't have to get involved with anything if they don't want to. Giving people invitations, giving them opportunities, but we're okay to say no to everything if that's what we want to do. Doing a sensory audit, just checking the things in the environment that young people can really struggle with. The biggest one we've always had is rain. So just like if it's going to rain, put shelters up. Every single giant meltdown we've had at our forest school, there's been 2 in 4 years, has been because the shelter broke. So making sure you have a shelter that's done really well is really important as well. And again, knowing those low arousal strategies, so you can do training from people like Studio 3 who do really awesome low arousal training. And of course, we use the nest approach, which is what we created with our young people. Then after any sessions, I think two things are really important. So one is debriefing with young people, so checking in with how things are if they were struggling, but also for adult staff as well to work out if there's anything that's helpful for supporting a young person in the future. And finally, one thing we always do, which it can be really tricky to get time for, but I think it's really essential, is doing that collaborative problem solving between sessions. So if someone's really upset during a session, then for me, that means we need to do something before the next session starts. And there's two reasons for that. One is that if someone's had a really bad experience and they're really stressed, then they might need support to process that thing. They might start to see forest school as an anxious or scary place. So talking through it with someone can help them to sort of feel safe about that place or that experience again. A second thing is it helps to reduce sort of build up a tension between young people. I think like one thing which we're lucky we never have at our sessions is where someone comes in and they're just really annoyed at someone else from the start, and then they'll like start beef or throw sticks or say insults and that sort of stuff. Because every time there's an issue, we always speak to young people about it in between sessions to sort of help to relieve any tension and share each other's side of a story and that sort of stuff. I think that's really important to prevent the build up of those like strong, really tricky emotions that can happen. Not because anyone's done anything wrong, but because there's miscommunication or because one young person gets dysregulated and then tells someone to piss off, and then the other one thinks, oh no, they hate me, when actually they were just dysregulated. And explaining that to them then helps to sort of fix that. So there's things like that which I think are really important. Yeah. So that's that bit. I've got one more topic and then I'll go to questions if that's okay, which is supporting neurodivergent staff. This is actually the biggest bit because so many people asked about it. So I wanted to share lots of things which we do as a staff team, and some might be helpful, some might not be, but I'll share them. Okay, so the first one is recognizing that if someone is neurodivergent, it means they have executive functioning differences. So that means that people might really struggle to get started on doing activities, or they might do things very last minute, or, you know, two things I think about. One is I hate doing admin. It's like it's from the devil. I hate it with every piece of my soul, but there's things that can help with that. So for example, we do body doubling sessions where we'll go on a video call together, not speak to each other, and just type, and that accountability somehow just helps to get stuff done. Second thing for me is I'm a perfectionist. If I write something, it has to be absolutely perfect. So but then that doesn't work because things don't always start perfect. So then we have people on my team where I say, please just write something, anything, and then I'll fix it. So like if you've got a rubbish first draft, you can use that to sort of write something good. That's what I do with like policies and other stuff like that. And having reminders for doing stuff's really helpful. And the second part of that is, for me, my brain is like a thing where, like, if I'm interested in something, I can do it for hours and hours and hours, but there's other things which I really struggle to do until last minute. One example for me, any training course I've ever done ever, or any webinar, I've written the webinar on the day or the day before. Like I finished this webinar 20 minutes before we came on. Not because that's my intention. It's just because before then I can sit for 12 hours straight and try to do it, and it just doesn't bloody work, and it's impossible. And like it's that readjustment of expectation of it's going to get done. It's just going to be last minute, and like accepting that that's just how some people experience things. Like I spent years trying to fix it and it doesn't work. I've been invited to speak at a conference in a few months, and they said I need to send a presentation 2 weeks in advance. And I said, I'm really sorry, like that's not going to happen. You can get it the day before, or I'm not doing it. I'm sorry, but yeah. When it comes to executive function differences, I talked about monotropism and having that deep focus on stuff, so I won't talk about it again. Next thing is socialization differences. There are so many things that are seen as normal, which are really confusing and don't make much sense. And I've got this quote from Chris Bonello, which I love, and I always read it out. I'm going to do it again. It says, I'm autistic, which means everyone around me has a disorder that makes them say things they don't mean, not care about structure, fail to hyper-focus on singular important topics, have unreliable memories, drop weird hints, and crudely stare into my eyeballs. So why do people say you're the weird one? Because there's more of them than me. And I think that's true for like a lot of neurodivergent people, where there's some things which are seen as normal. And I just think like, why? Just do what works for you. Like when I talk to young people, one of my favorite things is we often don't do small talk. We don't say hi, the weather's nice, how's the garden? Like we just go straight into saying the new Minecraft movie trailer came out and it's really crap. Is the movie going to be good? Who knows? And we just skip. Imagine if you never did any small talk in your whole life, how much time would you save? And you could learn an instrument, you could learn a new language. There's so many possibilities if you just skip that stuff that isn't really that useful. And living life very different can be really, really helpful as well. So I hate Christmas. It's evil. I can't stand it. Like, some people love it and I just don't get it, and that should be okay. Like, Spectrum Gaming's open on Christmas days because I would rather be on SG and keep it open rather than having one day of the year where you pretend that you care about some people and everyone pretends they care about you for one day, then you don't speak to them for the rest of the year again. And it's just this weird thing that makes no sense. I don't really get it. Yeah. A bit low on time, so I won't go through. I wrote a long list of things that I thought it would be cool to explain about differences in socializing, but I don't think there's time, so I'll skip that. Yeah. Next thing is, I talked about selective mutism, and a lot of people experience anxiety around communication, but it's really important to recognize that affects adults too. So if you have a neurodivergent forest leader in the woods, if you're in a log circle and they're asked to say something, people can find that really, really difficult if they're asked to speak on the spot. So it might be helpful to agree with a staff team. How do you feel about that? And then make an agreement that you won't point at someone and say, hey, do this thing for the people. And this includes singing too. Like, I don't care about singing. My voice is horrific. I don't sing at our sessions because our young people will leave and never come back. But for some people, it's really, really terrifying. So when you sing a song and expect all the kids to join in, there might be someone on my team who's thinking, oh my gosh, someone please help me. This is awful. I don't want to be here. And I think that's a really important consideration as well. Yeah, I think one thing I recognize with our team is people's level of communication can sort of change based on level of stress. So if people are really, really stressed or quite overwhelmed, you then have that freeze response where you might be to talk when you're calm and relaxed, but when you're really overwhelmed, you might not be able to. So that's an important thing to recognize. And then you can work out, are there any adaptations that you can make based on that? When we have team meetings online, we have an agreement that people don't have to have a video on ever. People don't ever have to talk. They can use the chat. And for some of our staff, that is really important for their well-being because people's communication does change day to day. Next point, processing time is really, really important. And there's so many things which I think just make things so much better. Again, because of time, I won't explain these random images I've got. But things like, if you're having a meeting with people, can you give agendas or information in advance? One thing which I'm really crap at is someone asks me a question on the spot. If it's not something I've already thought about before, then I can't answer it and I'm really rubbish and I waffle. And sometimes I answer a question, then 10 minutes later I say, actually, what I said was a lie. Please, can I give an actual answer now that I've thought about it? So giving information and context in advance can be really helpful. With all of our staff interviews, we always send people questions in advance because if you have spontaneous questions, you're not testing that person's ability to do the job, you're testing that person's ability to answer spontaneous questions well. So it doesn't really make sense to have that expectation on people. I actually thought I always ask as a reasonable adjustment to have questions in advance, but I had an interview for something a couple of weeks ago, and I intentionally didn't ask just to see what sort of funny stuff I came up with. And it was quite a wild interview and I was just completely waffling the whole time. But yeah, next thing is playing to people's strengths. I think that is one of the things which I love that we're able to do in our organization and which I think is possible within most forest schools. And I always think about games when it comes to this. Some people are like mages. You are very good at magic. You might be able to cast spells and heal people. But at the same time, you might have really low health. However, there are other people who might be a warrior. They can chop down a tree in no time. And if there's some zombies, they'll be able to sort of defend you against them all. However, if they need to heal someone or they need to solve a puzzle, they might really struggle with that. And asking a mage to cut down a tree would be really silly. It doesn't make sense. And it's the exact same thing in that everyone has their own unique strengths and difficulties, and playing to them is really, really important. At our sessions, it's really important that staff have flexibility in what they do. Like for me, I'm just energy. I just love to run around and scream and we play Shrek hide and seek. I role play as an ogre for an hour and run around chasing after everyone. There are other staff members who hate hide and seek. That isn't their skill. So while I go and run around like a maniac, they will then spend some time with some of the kids who are a bit more quiet. And, we've got one staff member who's really, really crafty. So I'm running around with 20 kids. That person's with a group of 3 kids creating something really, really epic. And playing to those strengths and what people are good at is really important. If I was asked to be crafty with 2 kids for 20 minutes, I can't sit down for that long. Like, it's going to fail from the start. So recognizing people's strengths and playing to them is really important, I think. Especially when you're neurodivergent, because one of the key traits of being neurodivergent is having spiky profiles. So you might have unique strengths in some areas that some people don't have, but you also might have unique sort of difficulties in things that most people tend to find easy. One example for me is I'm an absolute disorganized mess. Like if I'm working with young people, I think I'm very good at understanding young people's energy and the support they need. However, when it comes to writing a feedback form or a report after it, I'm bloody useless. And it's it's just important to recognize that and sort of either make people focus on their strengths or put support in place for the things they have to do that they struggle with. Spiky kids need spiky mentors. Yes, 100%. Yeah. Another thing that I think is really important, but I think also quite sad to say, is I think that if you've made it to adulthood and been recognized as a neurodivergent person, that often means that you have faced significant struggles to get to that point. Like, I think a lot about things like the diagnostic process for things like autism and ADHD. To get to a point of being referred for a diagnosis, the diagnostic criteria is based on difficulty and struggle. So you have to have struggled a heck of a lot to get to that point. Like when I was diagnosed as autistic. I was diagnosed with severe anxiety and with severe depression. And to get to that point of getting diagnosed, you have to have faced so much struggle, and it takes a lot of time to recover from that. It's like, yeah, it's really, really tricky. And then once you get your diagnosis, it's then not like you don't just get a diagnosis and you're free. It's like it's a fight to get access to any service. Like when I was diagnosed, I was invited to an autism bingo group. I don't even like bingo. Like I was referred to CBT 7 times, and I was discharged every time. And the last CBT therapist I saw said, I am going to have severe anxiety for the rest of my whole life, and there's nothing I'm able to do about it. And at that time, I was struggling so much, I wasn't leaving my room. I wasn't going out the house. The only time I went out my house in 3 months was to go to Spa at night time to get food and to go to this appointment. And I was told I'm always going to be that way. And it's just like everything's a fight, even once you get to that point of diagnosis. So if there is someone who is autistic, who is neurodivergent on your staff team, the chances are they've had a lot of those struggles. So people have those things, like they might have a lot of anxiety or trauma or other things, and it's really important to put support in place for those things as well. If you saw me sort of 7 years ago when I was first diagnosed, I would be unrecognizable. I struggled to speak to anyone. I barely left the house. I just struggled to do anything or be around anyone all the time. And now I'm the opposite. I still have some things that I really struggle with now, but yeah, there's a lot of recovery that comes with that neurodivergent journey. It's it's such a shame that the diagnostic process and things are the way they are. It's like you spend so much time trying to fit in, it doesn't work. You have a breakdown, you then have to recover from that to then go on and be your free neurodivergent self. Why can't you just be free to be yourself from the start? And it's really, really tricky. The other thing to think about here is because of those difficulties, people might have their own individual triggers, which are really important to understand and accommodate for as well, and make adaptations based on that. I think often one big thing on our team, I'll come into that soon. Yeah, I'll skip that. I said earlier about the idea that young people do well if they can, and I think it's really important that this extends to adults too. It's people do well if they can. Every single person does the best they can based on their current level of stress, the needs that they have, and their skills. So when it comes to adults too, adults need that exact same compassion as young people do. When it comes to things like identifying barriers and collaborative problem solving, I think all of that is really, really, really important. And when it comes to that and what support people need, and this is really cringe because I've quoted myself, but I think unlearning is so much more important than learning. When it comes to what neurodivergent people need, often you'll go on a training course or you'll see something online and it says that there's these set things that each person needs. And it's just a bunch of nonsense. It's about that individual person and what works based on their individual needs and individual situation. I always think about, I call them copy and paste autism strategies, where there's a list of strategies which you're told you should use for all autistic people. One of them is, if you speak to an autistic person, you must give them 10 seconds to process everything you say because they have slow processing time. If you say anything else, the 10 seconds starts again. And this is something that goes on all autism training. I just think, like, who made that up? Because it's like, it's not even true. Like, what are you yapping about? I don't understand. Like, if someone's very stressed, they might need more processing time, but by default, autistic people don't need 10 seconds to process things. Where is it from? And the other thing people always say is, with every autistic person, always use very simple, clear, basic language. And what used to happen to me when I worked at a local authority, people would talk to me normally. Once they found out I was autistic, it was like a light switch, and they suddenly become really, really patronizing. And I hated it more than anything else on the planet. And it's really frustrating. So yeah, rather than just using copy and paste strategies, listen to the individual and what they need. And that's it. Next point. We are really, really, really fortunate on our team that we have a clinical psychologist on our team. So she does clinical supervision and debriefing with all of our staff. I don't think you need someone on your team to offer that, but I think that supervision and debriefing is really, really important. I think when people are neurodivergent, as I said, people have often gone through a lot of struggles, and that then means if a young person is struggling, you can feel that really, really deeply. Like for me, if a young person's struggling, I get really, really deeply affected by that, and it can be really, really tricky. One thing that we talk a lot about on our team is about workplace trauma and like compassion fatigue, where people are struggling so much and you want to fix it, but it's not as simple as that, because there are just so many structures and systems in the government and schools and stuff that don't work for young people, that you're trying to fix something which you can't fix, and that's really like tricky and traumatizing in itself. And so I think having access to that supervision and debriefing is really important, not just for your own well-being, but also for the young people you support as well. Because if you're really stressed, then you can't be compassionate and curious and empathetic. When you have a high level of stress, that's when you go into that plan A mode where you need control. You go into that plan A mode where you need control and you're not able to sort of do what young people need. And having a place to sort of vent and share your struggles enables you to continue to be curious and compassionate towards people. So I think having access to things like supervision is quite essential. Yeah. How many more slides have I got? Sorry, I've taken a very long time. I've got 3 more slides. Next one. People asked a lot about staff ratios and what staff ratios should be if you have a group of neurodivergent young people. And my answer to that is, what ratios did you need to be calm and present when you're supporting people? It's about young people having their individual care needs met, but it's also about your own sense of safety. Because as I just said, if you're not feeling in control and safe, then you're not able to hold the space and be curious and be compassionate towards people. So at our forest school sessions, we have a ratio of 1 to 5. So 1 adult staff for 5 young people. When we have that ratio, I can be in the woods and be completely comfortable and present and know that I can give young people the care and attention they need. If we don't have that ratio, then it's a bit more like, it's stressful, and like that something could happen at one moment and you're not in control anymore. So like for me, that's the right ratio that works for us, but it might be different for everyone. You might be really confident and think, a 1 in 10 ratio works for me, and like I'm confident managing all that small people energy and emotion, but for me it's like a 1 to 5. But I think it's that thing of like, it's different for everyone. And again, we're quite privileged that because we're not attached to a school and we're well funded, we have a privilege to have that ratio, whereas I know that some people don't always, and I feel a lot of sympathy for people who can't. I'm sorry, that's probably not helpful, but yeah. Again, like I said before, adults experience sensory differences too. So things like dress code. Do you have to wear a work uniform? If you do, is it comfortable, or is it like sensory hell? Yeah, I have adaptations, so people feel comfortable with what they're doing. Most of our staff have like work hoodies that have our logo on. I never wear mine, but like we have that sort of stuff, so people feel like comfortable with what we're doing. And yeah, access to work is a really, really great tool where if someone is neurodivergent, you get free stuff to help them to keep the job. Like I have a stand-up desk, so I always stand up because otherwise I can't sit down and concentrate all the time. You can probably hear it whir. Can you hear that? It's going down, but it's going up again. Anyway, so you can work out what you need, and the access to work team is actually really generous. You can get access to things like paid admin support or equipment you need to do your job and that sort of stuff. So those adaptations can be really helpful. Second to last slide is about masking. So again, just like with young people who mask, adults can do it too. So it's really important to recognize that sometimes people might say they're okay with things and do things, but they might not always be that comfortable with that sort of stuff happening. And like for me, I feel like we've got to a point recently where we do have that quite like equal power balance on the staff team. So if I make a decision or share an idea and people think it's a rubbish idea, people will say it and tell me I'm talking rubbish. And like for me, that is so powerful and important that everyone on the staff team feels able to do that, even though I created SG. So I'm the apparent important one, which sounds really cringy. We can have a new youth worker join the team and within a few weeks say, actually, like, this is a better idea, let's do it. And having that sort of thing where you have that equal power balance, I think is really important for staff well-being. Yeah. Final thing is all of these like little things I've talked about. As I said, I think it's really important that they don't just apply to people who have a diagnosis. It's really important for everyone. I feel like for me, I got to a point where 7 years ago, I reached a point of burnout where I was struggling so much that I couldn't leave the house. I was diagnosed with severe anxiety and severe depression. It was the most difficult experience of my whole life ever. And I wish no one experiences that. But as a result of that, what I learned is I have no other choice but to live in a way that is authentic, where I'm being myself, because anything else isn't sustainable. But when we think about it, everyone is weird. Like no one's normal. Everyone has their own quirks and things that make them different. And rather than hiding them from the world, like just embrace it and like be yourself. And then like for some people that stops you from getting to the point that I got. And for everyone, it just means that you're quite happy and like less boring. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Final thing I'll share. Sorry, I've taken so long again. Actually, I'm not going to share it. Let's just go to questions if that's okay. Yeah. Thank you for coming. And any questions? We've got 8 minutes.
We've got one question, which was what do the Microsoft logo and the penguin represent?
Oh, yeah. So when one of the big things in spectrum gaming that I found very frustrating for a very long time is when young people get an autism diagnosis, they're not told what it is. So it's really confusing. It doesn't make sense. So we did some workshops with young people to say, okay, let's ditch your diagnostic criteria. What actually is autism? And one of the things they found helpful as one part of autism was those sort of descriptions of like what young people basically said is most people their brains work like a Windows PC, where things are quite easy and like automatic. And like when you load up the PC, it's set up for what you need to do. Whereas a lot of autistic people's brains are like a Linux PC. So the Penguin's like the Linux brand. And the way they work is you don't start with everything ready set up. You have to sort of program it yourself, which then means that as a result of that, there's more customization. You can have more features, but it's also more prone to error because like if you type something wrong or get something wrong, that can be disastrous. And like our young people thought that was a really helpful description of how autistic brains work. The reason that was shared on that slide was that thing of when people have processing time, it then gives them the time to look at it in lots and lots of detail. And often that leads to coming up with better things and like thinking outside the box and all that sort of stuff. Yeah.
Brilliant. Loads of people saying thank you, and it's been very incredibly helpful, thought-provoking, energetic, challenging. I'd like to echo that, Andy. It's been brilliant, really, really, really brilliant. So thank you very much for sharing that.
Thank you. Any questions?
Any advice about how to ease transitions back after a session?
Yes. Sophie, can I ask what you mean by transitions back? Like transitions back to what?
I'm going to unmute. Is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
So we work within schools and we run 2-hour sessions. And we have lovely sessions until the very end. And we try really hard not to mention tidy up time or any of that, so to keep the language out of it. But the children know. And any issues we have are always related to that moment of transition or the expectation of the transition back to school. I just wondered if you had any advice about how to kind of make that gentler for the children.
Thank you. I've got a really rubbish answer, which is probably like make the school better. I don't know. If you're in a really affirming, awesome space for 2 hours, like, why would you want to leave it? I don't know. But I think that's a tricky thing where it might not always be a simple answer to that. One thing that I do think a lot about is actually chasing a Shrek. One of the things which I think a lot about actually is when it comes to forest school practice, if that is done in a school environment, how much influence can that have on the school environment? So, for example, a lot of people in forest school practice know about the importance of like relational approaches and like not using things like rewards and punishments and that sort of stuff. But then young people go back into the classroom and they've got a behavior chart and they're getting told off for things and that sort of stuff. So then it's like that thing of like, if schools see how important that forest school is, can they take any learning about what makes it so special and so affirming, and can they implement that into the school? But again, that's a giant task where like, yeah. Sorry, that doesn't help, does it? I'm really sorry, but that's the first thing that came to my mind. But
No,
yeah,
thank you very much.
thank you. Full time forest school for everyone. Yes.
That'd be amazing, wouldn't it? That's brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Andy. And we'll release this when we've put the videos together. We'll release it on our YouTube channel, and you can watch it back again. Because like so many people have said, really, really inspiring, and you can share it then with people that weren't able to be here. I will put that feedback form there. So if anyone wants to give some feedback about tonight's webinar or ideas for other topics, things like that, we'd be really, really grateful for that.
Thank you.
It all helps with the advocacy, and giving some comments to our expert speakers is always really, really wonderful as well, because we do appreciate the time Andy's given up this evening, like we do with all of our speakers. Brilliant.
Thank you. I was wanting to say sorry if I was a bit waffly. I decided at 5 p.m. last night, but I was going to ditch my plan and make completely new slides, so I wrote them all today. Yeah.
Honestly, it didn't show you. You're a very talented, very inspiring speaker. So thank you very, very much.